Today we are in week 3 of our series Square One, starting strong, finishing well. Right, we are starting strong so that we can finish well. We want to have to create and maintain spiritual habits, fully engaging in these spiritual habits that are going to help us grow spiritually and help us continue, and not only today and this week, this month, but throughout this year and throughout our lifetime, so we can finish this life well. And so that's really what Square One is all about. Week 1, we talked about how the book is better than the movie, and we talked about how this book is there's a lot of great wisdom, a lot of great application that can come out of this book, and it's way better than the movie. Last week we talked a little bit about prayer and how we can have transformative conversations with God. And this week, as Tim alluded to, we're going to talk a little bit about worship. And like last week, we're not going to just talk about it. We're going to put it into practice. We're going to engage in it. And so I think that's really important for all of us to do. Let me ask you this something. I want to take a moment before we kind of get into that and ask you and talk about intentions and really after intentions. What did you intend to happen today when you came here? And I know these questions are rhetorical, but kind of think about it. What are you intending to do after church? Like, are you like already thinking about lunch? Are you already thinking about the Chiefs-Titans game? Are you already thinking about like what are you going to do? Like, have you made already kind of plans, your after intentions this week, this year? The reason I bring this up and a message about worship is because I believe our intentions can actually help us engage or actually help us disengage with God. We're wanting to connect with God, and we want to. This whole idea of coming together in a worship service is to help you connect with God. And sometimes our intentions or our after intentions, what we intend to do after, really kind of impede what we're going into something with, how we're going to connect with, and how we're going to engage with God. In fact, I want to bring this passage up. This is in the book of Acts, chapter 12. Luke wrote the book of Acts. Luke was a physician, but he investigated a bunch of things, talked to a bunch of eyewitnesses about Jesus, and really wrote the Gospel of Luke, and then wrote Acts as kind of a follow-up. This is the Acts of the Apostles. And in chapter 12, the church is kind of gaining momentum. They just had a time where Peter had a vision that said that this message of the gospel, this message of Jesus is not just for the Jewish people, but it's for all people. Something that Paul was trying to tell him all along, but Peter kind of had to have this vision. He had this vision, and now the church is kind of gaining steam that this message is for everyone. There's this hope for everyone. And this is where we find ourselves in Acts chapter 12. It says this: about that time, King Herod Agrippa began to persecute some believers in the church. He had the apostle James, John's brother, killed with the sword. And then when Herod saw how much this pleased the Jewish people, he also arrested Peter. And this took place during the Passover celebration. Just think about that. And that's kind of a mantra today, right? When we see something is actually gaining favor, well, all right, then let me do something else. So he had James put to death, and he's like, oh man, everybody's good with that? Good. Let me arrest Peter. So here in verse 4, he imprisoned him, placing him under the guard of 4 squads of 4 soldiers each. Herod intended to bring Peter out for a public trial after the Passover. But while Peter was in prison, the church prayed very earnestly for him. And then the next section is all about how Peter escaped from prison miraculously. But I highlight that word, that verse right before that said Herod intended to put him on trial and to really, after the Passover. What we have to understand is we can just read that and just kind of scoot on right by that verse. But the Passover was a celebration. It was a spiritual celebration of how God miraculously intervened in the lives of people. And so there was a lot of connecting with God that was going to happen at the Passover. And what Herod was doing was like, you know what? I got James put to death. I've arrested Peter, and now I fully intend to put him on trial and to kind of do whatever we can to Peter right after this spiritual celebration. What are your intentions? What are your after intentions? It's really important that we kind of take into account what our intentions are for not only today, but what our intentions are and how we connect with God. And that's really kind of what worship is. And there's other passages in the Old Testament is filled with passages about warnings about worship. In fact, one of them is found in Ezekiel chapter 33. And this is kind of God speaking through the prophet Ezekiel and speaking to him saying, this is what people are saying. He says this in verse 30 of chapter 30. He says, Son of man, your people talk about you in their houses and whisper about you at the doors. They say to each other, come on, let's go hear the prophet tell us what the Lord is saying. That's like, you come into church, right? I don't know if you talk about me before you come to church, but this is kind of what that would be. So my people come pretending to be sincere and sit before you. They listen to your words, but they have no intention of doing what you say. Their mouths are full of lustful words, and their hearts seek only after money. You are very entertaining to them, like someone who sings love songs with a beautiful voice or plays fine music on an instrument. They hear what you say, but they don't act on it. Now, I know that's not true about this place, right? It's all about our intentions. Sometimes we intend just to go to church, and then we're like, you know what? I can't wait. We're going to do that. I'm going to kind of get it over with. I'm going to do kind of my duty, and then I'm going to go about my day and do the things that I really want to do because that's really where my mind is right now. And so maybe you've come in here, you're like, you know what? I hope to hear something nice. I hope to kind of connect with God, but I'm really just kind of be there to be there. But what Ezekiel's saying is, what God is saying to Ezekiel is like, hey, these people have no intention of applying anything that you say to their lives. And in the book of Amos, chapter 5, God is kind of fed up with this attitude of the people of that day. And he says this, and this is from the Message translation. I love this. This is in Amos 5:21. It says, I can't stand your religious meetings. I'm fed up with your conferences and conventions. I want nothing to do with your religion projects, your pretentious slogans and goals. I'm sick of your fundraising schemes, your public relations and image making. I've had all I can take of your noisy ego music. When was the last time you sang to me? He goes on to say that you want to know what I want? I want justice. I want oceans of it. I want fairness. I want rivers of it. That's what I want. That's all I want. This is God saying, you know what? What are you doing? Even when you come together, there's a lot of kind of stuff kind of going on. What are your intentions when you're here? And that's what I want to kind of talk about today is this idea of worship. And Jesus himself quoted the prophet Isaiah, and when he was on earth, and he said, "Hey, these people are far from me. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship is a farce," is what he says. And I don't want that for my life, and I don't want that for you. I don't think you want that for you either. I think in your heart of hearts, if you come to church and you're connecting with God, you want to connect with God. I think there is an encounter of God. When we experience God in the fullness of who he is, there's something, that is amazing about that. That's supernatural about that. That's transformative about that. And it happens in worship. So was coming to church today, was coming to experience and connect with God today, a formality or an intention? Have you ever asked yourself, what is worship? It's not singing. It's not the musical worship, although that's a manifestation of what worship is in our lives. Because we can stand in one of those incredible experiences where we feel like God is so tangible and so real. But there can be other times where you can be standing in that kind of environment and everyone else is having one of those moments, but you're not. So what is it? And you might not just be feeling it. And our first common response is asking the question, why? We might say things like, hey, if we were just more spiritual then when we did experience God's presence, we're not as much now. Maybe I was doing a little bit more. Maybe I was more engaged in some spiritual habits back then than I am now, and that's why I'm not really having this encounter with God. Or what if I did more? Or what if I, kind of bring something that really cost me? Then God's going to respond to me, and God's going to, if I really kind of pour out. That God doesn't respond to us in that sense. Everything that we do is a response to God. Everything. We don't do, and then he responds. He has already done, and we respond. That's kind of the heart behind worship. The sense that we have to do something or we have to earn something or we have to perform in a certain way to get God's attention, for God to be approved, and then for him to pour out his blessings over us is not correct. We don't do anything and then God responds because of what we do. He's already done everything and we respond to who he is and what he's done. You cannot do anything to earn a response from God. You can't worship hard enough or shout loud enough to earn some sort of visitation from God. He has already done, and we are the ones who are responding to what he's done. All the translations of the Bible together, there are about 2,500 references to the word worship. The first one was way back in the days of Enosh, who was the son of Seth, who was the son of Adam. So way back in the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve didn't need faith to believe that God was real. Kind of walked and talked with God in the garden, right? They didn't need faith to believe that God was real. Like Seth didn't necessarily need, Cain and Abel didn't necessarily need to faith to believe that. They had firsthand account from their parents, right? But as we kind of go down the line, you can understand from generation to generation, the next generation, you can understand that it would take some faith to believe that God is real. They didn't have the same type of relationship. So we see that. We see it way back in the early days in the book of Genesis. Another reference to worship is when Abraham takes Isaac up on the hill, up on the mountain to offer him as a sacrifice. They didn't go there to sing songs. He was going up there to offer a sacrifice, and it's called an act of worship to God. In the New Testament, we see when the disciples saw Jesus walking on the water, it says they worshiped God. Again, I don't think they sang kind of this, glorious like we sang this morning. They worshiped him, and they said, "This is it. You are God's son for sure." And they worshiped him, it said. The vast majority of worship in the Old Testament, and there's a whole lot to speak of, places of worship, but there are even more to talk about an act of worship, like offerings and sacrifices and things like that. The only real definition of worship, or the word worship recorded in the Bible, is in Romans chapter 12, 1, where it says that we should offer our bodies as living sacrifices. This is our spiritual act of worship, that we should offer ourselves. Worship is all of that. Worship is a noun, right? Worship of God. Worship is also a verb, how we worship God, right? Worship is an adjective, a description of something, like a worshipful heart or a spirit or person or whatever. But if I was going to simplify the definition of worship down to something memorable, this is what I think I would say. I think that worship is the sound of love. What does love sound like? We know what kind of love looks like. We know how love is acted out. What does love sound like? In Mark chapter 12, we get this commandment that Jesus kind of says, hey, he's being tested, and he quotes these two commands and say, hey, this sums up everything. Mark 12, verse 30, it says, "And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength." The sound of love. Loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. What does it mean to love God with all of your heart? It's control. It's fundamental. Loving God with all your heart, it's the beginning where all of our worship kind of stems from. It's kind of the Job effect, right? If God does nothing, yet I will praise him. If God doesn't bless us, doesn't give us peace, doesn't give us breakthrough or success or deliverance, if he doesn't do any of that, I'm still going to love God with my heart. Francis Chan, in his book Crazy Love, says it this way. He says, "When you're truly in love, you go to great lengths to be with the one you love. You'll drive for hours to be together, even if it's for a short while. You don't mind staying up late to talk. Walking in the rain is romantic, not annoying. You'll willingly spend a fortune on the one you're crazy about. When you're apart from each other, it's painful, even miserable. He or she is all you think about. You jump at any chance to be together. Is your love, is my love for God unmatched by any other relationship?" A.W. Tozer, who is a pastor, theologian, So true worship is to be so personally and hopelessly in love with God that the idea of a transfer of affection never even remotely exists. To be so personally and hopelessly in love with God that it doesn't even cross your mind that you could have that kind of love for anybody else. And we get the idea of loving with all of our heart. We get that. We can experience that for a loved one, a spouse, right? We get that. But our love for God with all of our heart is like magnifying that love. Loving God with all of our soul, my essence, my identity, my life, my choices. Does everything I do and everything I am scream that I'm in love with God? Psalm 34 says, "My soul will boast in the Lord." Does the most inner part of me boast in God? Does my most inner part boast? Does it kind of say, does it scream out that I'm in love with God? Does it boast in God? My soul must make him famous. My soul must praise and honor him. Only then can I, with complete confidence, say what actually the psalmist says in the verse before that, I will bless the Lord at all times. In Psalm 84, he says, my soul yearns, even faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and flesh cry out for the living God. In Psalm 42, it says, as a deer pants for the water, even my soul longs for you. It pants after you. My soul longs for the living God. There's something about loving God with all of your soul, your essence, your identity. Craves love, craves God. You were designed to crave God's love. We were created to know God and to know love. And it's love that moves God towards us and love that pulls us toward him. It's kind of a dated movie, but at the 21 grams. Have you ever seen that movie? The very beginning of that movie, the opening kind of voice that you hear at the beginning of the movie says this. They say we all lose 21 grams at the exact moment of our death. Everyone. The weight of a stack of nickels, the weight of a chocolate bar, the weight of a hummingbird. What is that? We are more than just water and dust. The breath of life, the essence of life. Our soul craves to know God and love God. It's all about our choices. It's all about our lifestyles. It's all about our daily decisions. It's our identity. How do we love God with all of our soul? And then loving God with all of our mind. Loving him with our mind means that you making the most of your mind by learning as much as you can about as much as you can. Learn about it. Don't kind of stifle learning. Don't quit learning. How do we love God with all of our mind? Let's keep learning about God. Let's keep learning about the ways of God. Let's keep learning about this, where we live and the people that we live with and what God's doing in all of this creation. When we try to quantify the unquantifiable and classify the unclassifiable, we actually demystify God. We can keep learning, but it doesn't mean that we're going to know everything. But sometimes we can get too smart for our own good, right? And we're like, you know what? Because when we do that, we make him into a God that kind of fits into nice cognitive categories. The God who conveniently fits in within the confines of your mind will never fill your heart or fill your soul with wonder. So when you stop learning, you stop loving, because loving is learning more and more about the one that you love. If we got up here today and we took a couple married couples and we started doing the newlywed game, it's all about knowing the person you love, right? How much you know. But the more you're married, the more and more you know about that person you love, because you're learning. You're constantly learning what they like, what they don't like, what makes them tick, what makes them angry. You know them. You can't stop learning about the one you love. Loving God with half our mind isn't good enough. Half-minded is being like half-hearted. And double-minded is like being distracted from loving God with all your mind. God wants to sanctify every part of your mind for his purposes. sanctified logic, sanctified intuition, sanctified imagination, even a sanctified sense of humor. Loving God with all your minds means managing your mind. It means making the most of your mind. It means loving him logically and creatively and seriously and humorously and intuitively and thoughtfully. It means not just taking in what we hear as kind of gospel. If we always take in what we hear, what is preached, what we read, what people tell us, and we never use our minds to think about things or test things, we lose the creative beings that we were made to be. We lose the purposeful beings that we were made to be. So love God with all your mind. Love God with all your strength. It means expending a tremendous amounts of energy for kingdom causes. It means work. It means servanthood and sacrifice and good old-fashioned hard work. We should be willing to work for the Lord, but it is a matter of grace on God's part. And the opinion is that we should not be concerned about working for God until we have learned the meaning and the delight of worshiping him. Because out of our delight of worshiping God, now we are actually enabled and empowered to do work for God. Anything less than leveraging all of our strength for God's purpose is boring at best and hypocritical at worst. If you love something or someone long enough, the expenditure of energy isn't seen as a chore. It's seen as more of as a privilege, because love turns work into worship. So love God with all your strength. In fact, the Greek word for strength means the antithesis of apathy. So how should we worship? There's a passage in John chapter 4 where Jesus meets a woman at the well, Samaritan woman, and these Samaritans and Jews didn't necessarily get along at that time. And his disciples had gone away to get some food, and Jesus met this woman at a well and asked her to kind of get some water for him. And he was like, "Hey, if you knew who I was, if you just knew who I was, you wouldn't be asking me. You'd be asking me something different. You'd be asking me for the living water." And so they got them onto a discussion about worship. And so she had kind of these reasoning about how Samaritans worship. And Jesus says this in verse 23. He says, "Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks." And what's interesting about this verse is that if we kind of knowing the backstory of the Samaritans and the Jewish people at this time, right? Because this kind of Samaritanism, the attitude in the Bible, this Old Testament reveals that Jeroboam, the first king of Israel, after it became the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom split, he set up two places of worship because he wanted to be sure that his people were kind of weaned from the habit of worshiping in Jerusalem. And so he installed golden calves to be worshipped in convenient places for them, Bethel and Dan. And so the kind of the heresy of Samaritanism, and think about this because I think it applies today, was the practice of picking out what we like to worship and rejecting what we do not like. And it was widespread in those days. And so think about that in the context of this conversation that Jesus is having with this Samaritan woman. It's not her fault. It's kind of the way she was brought up and the way she grew up. But Jesus said, "Hey, if you knew who I was, if you had any idea who I was, you wouldn't be asking me for this. You'd be asking me for living water." And then Jesus kind of says the full thing. Hey, the time is coming, and it's actually here right now where the true worshipers will worship God in spirit and in truth. Notice the Father is actually seeking worshipers. The Father wasn't seeking the best communicators and the most charismatic leaders, the best, the richest of the rich, those who have the most followers, but instead the Father is searching for worshipers. And here's where we kind of have some of this inward conversation with this, because you may say, "Well, I'm a follower of Jesus, but I may not be an amazing worshiper." You are an amazing worshiper. We all are worshipers. Worshiping is simply showing what we value, showing what is worth something to us. For instance, if you've ever seen a sporting event and you love the team, what do? You celebrate and you worship. We don't call it worship, but that's kind of what it is. If you go to a concert and you love whoever is playing there, what do? We shout and we scream and, we want to get selfies and we want to get as close as we possibly can. We worship. We don't call it that, but that's what's going on. Passion, enthusiasm, worship, love, admiration. There's a lot of other examples that we could probably pick from. Those are two. And here's the issue. It is worship, and it's actually really good worship. It's just a bad God. Like, people are going all out, pressing in as much as they can, really, giving everything they got, pouring out, everything they have, losing their voice, like just engaging as fully as they could possibly engage in this atmosphere is great worship. It's just not a great God. The challenge is sometimes in the church, we have the opposite. In the world, we may be good at worshiping a bad God, but sometimes in the church, we don't worship. We have bad worship to a good God. So we cannot worship in spirit and alone, for the spirit without truth is helpless. We cannot worship in truth alone, for that would be theology without fire. It must be the truth of God and the Spirit of God. Because when a person yielding to God and believing the truth of God is filled with the Spirit of God, even his faintest whisper will be worship. So since God is seeking true worshipers, we want to give God the worship and the honor and the glory that he is due. And so I want to just, for the next couple minutes, talk about how we worship. So a few thoughts, and then we're actually going to engage in it and connect in it. Because the first way I would like to talk about it is how we should worship with awe. Just like Jesus told the woman at the well, if you had any idea who I was, your reaction would probably be different. What if we walked in here and walked in this place every Sunday where you're sitting there going, I'm about to meet with the God of the universe today. I'm going to connect with the God of the universe today on a personal level. I'm going to worship him for who he is. If we came in there with that intention, with that expectation, what would happen? But that's how we would be worshiping with awe. Because the first thing we would say is that's kind of ridiculous logically. I can't believe I'm doing that. I don't even deserve to be doing that. But that's the awestruckness that we can have when we worship him. We worship with awe. The writer of Hebrews says, therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let's be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe. The psalmist says, come, let's bow down and worship. Let's kneel before the Lord, our Maker. That's kind of worshiping in humility and awe, saying, hey, you are glorified. You are worthy. We honor you because you are God and I am not. I can't even believe I'm able to have this interaction and connection with you. Do you know who you are? You're God. It's overcome. We can be overwhelmed. We can be overflowing with gratitude. The wise men bowed before Jesus. Simon Peter fell to his knees. One day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. When was the last time you've been stunned and kind of just in awe at the presence of God? Worship with awe. Secondly is worship with abandon. King David had just had a major victory, and they were having this parade back into the city. And he is worshiping God, and he kind of gets a little crazy. And his wife kind of calls him out on it and says, you humiliated yourself. Right before that, it was like David danced before the Lord with all his might. His wife says, you humiliated yourself. And David kind of retorted back and says, I was dancing before the Lord. This is in 2 Samuel chapter 6. And I'm willing to look even more foolish than this, even be humiliated in my own eyes. Worship with abandon. I think some of the things that hinder a lot of us from worshiping and really connecting and worshiping God with everything, with all of our heart, soul, mind, strength, is this idea of worshiping with abandon. We reserve ourselves too much because we're not sure what others are going to think when they see us actually let loose and worship God. Because of who God is, because of what he's done, I can't help but give him praise. It was kind of the sentiment David was talking about. And I think a few of you probably know what I'm talking about. If you've experienced his grace, and because of what he's done, you've got to give him praise. And sometimes you just have to shout. Sometimes you just have to clap. Sometimes you have to lift your voices and lift your hands and tell him that you love him. Tell him that he's good. That kind of gets us into the posture of worship. We can be so cramped into our posture of worship that we're like, I don't know what is acceptable or what is, it's worship, and it's between you and God. Who cares? Lifted hands means victory and surrender. Everything I have comes from you. Everything we live in and need comes from you. Maybe your posture, you have a posture of bowing your knees and in humility to God. Maybe it's shouting because there's excitement and there's magnification and there's unashamed praise. Maybe it's a posture of reflection where you're kind of just soaking in his presence, kind of waiting in his presence and inviting him in to move in your life and letting him move in your life. Worship with awe, worship with abandon, and then lastly, worship with intimacy. David said this in Psalm 27. He said, one thing I ask from the Lord, and it's alone do I seek, that I may dwell in his house all the days of my life and gaze on the beauty of the Lord and seek him in his temple. He wanted to be really close to God. And this is what God wants. He wants us to grow to know him intimately. Not just facts about him, but to know his character and his goodness kind of out of the time of time spent with him in his presence. So how do we worship? We worship with awe, we worship with abandon, we worship with intimacy. And this is probably going to be a stretch for a lot of people today, if I'm honest. Just like week 1, when we talked about how this book is better than the movie and how there's so much greatness in this book. And if we just read it and we just start to soak it in and we start to observe what's happening and apply it to our lives and actually live it out, it's going to be life-changing for us. And just like last week when we talked about the power of conversations with God and how our conversations with God can be transformative to our lives, worship is something that comes out of our life because of all that God has done for us and what he's already done. We're not responding God's not responding to us. We're responding to what he's already done. And it's kind of born out of this loving God with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind, and all of our strength. And so because we do that and because we kind of know him, we realize the magnitude of the God that we're worshiping, and we worship him with awe. And we realize that it's God, it's the audience of one that we're worshiping, and it doesn't matter who's around us. We're going to sing like nobody's listening and dance like nobody's watching, and we're going to worship with abandon, and we're going to worship with intimacy by getting to know him closer and closer and closer so we can just know his character and know his goodness and just let him speak into our lives. So I don't know what you came in today intending to do after, but I do know this: after intentions can change. That's the miracle of God encounters. On the day of Pentecost, 2 of nature's most destructive forces kind of met in this upper room: fire and wind. Wind rearranges things, and fire redefines things. And if God was saying anything on Pentecost, he was saying, I want to change. I want some things rearranged. I want some things redefined. I want some change. And when the Holy Spirit moves, he wants to change some things. And we see this picture in the Old Testament where they had this tabernacle, this kind of tents of meeting, and the Ark of the Covenant was placed in kind of this central section. And it's said that when people come into that tent, when people who enter the north gate come in, they have to leave by the south gate. And when people enter the south gate, they have to leave by the north gate. Nobody can enter and exit the way that they came in. It's because they had to come by and go by the presence of God. And the symbolism there is that if you encounter God, if you really experience God, there's no way that you walk out the same way you walked in. Something rearranges, something changes in you. Maybe a deeper love for him. It may just be something transformative in your life. It may be, but it's not the same. When people come and worship and they get in God's presence, if they begin to worship in spirit and truth and the word begins to fill them and change them and challenge them, inspire them, the law of worship says that if you get into his presence, you can't leave the same way you came in. You have to go out the opposite way. If you came in depressed, you can go out with joy. If you came in with a bad attitude and negative and having an offense and bitter, you leave with love and forgiveness and tenderness in your heart. If you come in with doubt and unbelief and wondering if you're going to make it, you leave knowing that God can do anything and everything on your behalf. And if we could just get one concept in our spirit, that when we come to church on Sundays, when we have our private times with him, when we all we're trying to do is get into the presence of God, because when we're in his presence, he's going to deal with our after intentions. So do you love Jesus? Do you love God? What does that sound like? How do you show that? Worship is a lifestyle. Worship is your life. But we have this musical form of worship every single week because it is an opportunity for you to show God and just worship God with awe, with abandon, with intimacy. It's just one form of worship, but it's a big one. What does the love sound like? How do you show that? So as the worship team kind of comes back up, and we're going to spend some time in worship today, I want you to do so with awe. I want you to do so with abandon, and I want you to do so with intimacy. And I realize that this might be a stretch for you, but maybe do something that you've never done before. Maybe it's lifting hands. Maybe it's kneeling. Maybe it's, being more vocal. Maybe it's just worship with awe, and don't let your neighbors or what's happening distract you. It's dark in here, and if you're up here, I can't see you anyway. There's nothing to be scared about is what I'm trying to say. Just worship God with awe and with abandon, and draw closer to him. Love him with all your heart. Love him with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. That's the sound of love. Worship. Worship is the sound of love. So for the next few moments, we're just going to spend some time worshiping God. And I just invite you to kind of take whatever posture of worship you want. Maybe it's standing and singing and shouting and lifting hands. Maybe it's kneeling. Maybe it's more reflection. But the important thing is not your posture. It's that you connect with God. And we just want to facilitate an opportunity that you can do that. You can just connect with him. Like I said, it may be something that you've never done before. But kind of let yourself go in this area. Let yourself loose. Show your love for God with all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your mind, all of your strength. We love him because he first loved us. And he loved us so unconditionally that he sent his son, Jesus, to die for us so that we could have access to this relationship with him. God has done so much for you. whether you realize it or not. And if you love God